May 5, 1945, just before dawn, atop a 400-foot vertical cliff on the island of Okinawa that American soldiers had started calling Hacksaw Ridge because of how many men it had already chewed through. The night before, an entire American battalion had fought its way up rope ladders onto that plateau, been savaged by a Japanese counterattack in the dark, and been forced to retreat back down the cliff face, leaving dozens of their own wounded scattered across the open ground behind them, still under fire, still alive, and completely out of reach. Private First Class Desmond Doss, a combat medic who has never once carried a weapon, who refuses on religious grounds to even touch a rifle, climbs back up that rope ladder alone while his entire company retreats in the opposite direction. For the next several hours, under machine gun fire, mortar fire, and constant threat of a Japanese soldier finding him at any second, one unarmed man will move from body to body across that plateau, find the wounded one at a time, drag or carry them to the edge of the cliff, and lower every single one of them down on a rope, using a knot he invented himself so an injured man wouldn't fall out of the loop. By the time the sun comes up, Desmond Doss will have saved somewhere between 50 and 75 men, alone, unarmed, on a battlefield his own battalion had already abandoned. This is the true story of the only conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, a man who went to war refusing to kill and ended up saving more lives than almost anyone who fought beside him. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, into a working-class family shaped almost entirely by religion. His parents were devout Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian denomination that held strict beliefs around nonviolence and the sanctity of the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," interpreted by the Doss family in the most literal and unwavering way possible. As a boy, Desmond saw a framed illustration hanging in his home depicting the biblical story of Cain murdering his brother Abel, and it left an impression on him that never faded, a conviction that taking another human life, under any circumstance, was something he could never bring himself to do. This wasn't a belief Desmond arrived at as a convenient excuse to avoid hardship. It was carved into him from childhood, tested repeatedly throughout his life, and it would go on to define nearly every decision he made once the Second World War came looking for him. By the time the United States entered the war in December of 1941, Desmond Doss was working as a joiner at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, a job that classified him for deferment from the draft because it directly supported the war effort. He could have stayed there for the duration of the war, safely exempt, and nobody would have questioned it. Desmond didn't want an exemption. He believed deeply that he had an obligation to serve his country, even if his faith would not allow him to kill for it. And in April of 1942, he voluntarily gave up his deferment and was drafted into the United States Army. He requested classification as a conscientious objector, not to avoid service entirely, which was an option available to him, but specifically so he could serve as a non-combatant, a medic, someone who could still stand on the battlefield beside his fellow soldiers without ever raising a weapon against another human being. The Army did not know quite what to do with him. Desmond Doss was assigned to the 77th Infantry Division, specifically to the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, as a company aide man, and from nearly the first day of basic training, he became a target. Fellow soldiers mocked him relentlessly, calling him a coward, accusing him of hiding behind religion to dodge the dangerous parts of soldiering, refusing to trust a man in their unit who wouldn't carry a rifle into combat alongside them. His refusal to handle weapons even during basic training drills created friction with officers who genuinely didn't understand how a man could function in an infantry unit without ever picking one up. Some officers actively tried to have him discharged or reclassified, viewing his stance as a liability that endangered the men around him rather than the quiet, deeply held conviction it actually was. He was harassed, isolated, and at one point faced an attempt to have him forcibly removed from the military entirely on psychological grounds, simply because commanding officers couldn't reconcile his faith with the demands of combat. Desmond endured all of it without ever wavering, insisting on his right to serve his country as a medic while holding to the beliefs that had shaped him since childhood. His unit shipped out to the Pacific, and Desmond Doss got his first opportunities to prove that an unarmed man could still be indispensable in combat. During the fighting on Guam in the summer of 1944, and again during the brutal campaign on Leyte in the Philippines later that same year, Doss repeatedly moved through active combat zones to treat and evacuate wounded soldiers, exposing himself to the same enemy fire as every rifleman around him, but doing it without ever carrying a weapon to defend himself. He earned 2 Bronze Stars for valor during the Leyte campaign alone, decorations awarded specifically for actions under fire, proof that even the soldiers who had once mocked him were beginning to understand exactly what kind of man they had in their company. The mockery didn't disappear entirely, but something else started to grow alongside it, a grudging, reluctant respect from men who had watched Desmond Doss run toward the sound of gunfire to reach a wounded soldier while everyone else around him was taking cover. Nothing in Guam or Leyte, however, prepared his unit for what waited for them on Okinawa. The invasion of Okinawa, launched in April of 1945, was intended by the Japanese High Command to be fought differently from the island battles that came before it. Rather than contesting the beaches, Japanese defenders under General Mitsuru Ushijima withdrew inland to a network of fortified ridgelines, caves, and tunnel systems carved into the island's rugged terrain, determined to make the Americans bleed for every ridge and every escarpment on the way to the island's interior. Among the most heavily defended of these positions was the Maeda Escarpment, a nearly vertical rock face rising some 400 feet above the surrounding terrain, honeycombed with Japanese tunnels, caves, and firing positions that gave defenders total command over anyone attempting to climb it. American soldiers who fought there gave it a name that captured exactly what it did to the men who tried to take it: Hacksaw Ridge. To reach the plateau atop the escarpment at all, American infantry had to climb cargo nets and rope ladders up the sheer rock face, fully exposed to Japanese fire the entire way up, before even beginning to fight for the ground itself. The 307th Infantry Regiment, including Desmond Doss's company, was ordered to take and hold that plateau in early May of 1945, and the fighting that followed was some of the most vicious close-quarters combat of the entire Pacific War. Japanese defenders, fighting from concealed positions in the honeycombed rock, launched repeated counterattacks against the American foothold on top of the ridge, and on the night the fighting reached its worst, an entire American company was caught in the open atop the plateau during a coordinated Japanese assault, taking catastrophic casualties before being forced to fall back down the escarpment they had bled so heavily to climb in the first place. When that retreat happened, dozens of wounded American soldiers were left behind on the plateau, some unable to move on their own, all of them still under active fire from a Japanese force that had not been driven off, all of them effectively stranded on a battlefield the rest of their unit had just abandoned. Desmond Doss refused to leave them there. While the rest of his company withdrew down the cliff face to relative safety, Doss climbed back up the same rope ladders his retreating comrades were coming down, moving alone, unarmed, directly toward the exposed ground where Japanese soldiers were still actively fighting, to find and treat men that everyone else had just accepted as lost. What followed was hours of methodical, almost unimaginable courage. Doss moved from wounded man to wounded man across that open plateau, crawling between positions to avoid drawing fire, treating injuries as best he could in the field, and then facing the same problem again and again. How does one unarmed man get a badly wounded soldier down a 400-foot cliff face, alone, under fire, without any of the equipment or manpower that would normally be required for that kind of evacuation? Doss solved it by tying a simple but ingenious knot, a specific type of loop that would stay secure around an unconscious or badly wounded man's body without slipping or cutting off circulation, allowing Doss to lower each soldier individually down the rock face on a rope, one at a time, working alone through the night and into the early morning hours. After lowering each man to safety at the base of the cliff, he would return to the top, find the next wounded soldier, and repeat the entire process, over and over, for as long as there were men left to save. He prayed through nearly all of it, according to accounts he gave later in life, a simple, repeated request, asking to be allowed to save just one more man before the next one, and then the one after that, Nobody was counting his progress in real time. There was no way to know, in the middle of that night, how many men Doss was actually bringing down, because the fighting hadn't stopped, and there was no guarantee he would survive the next trip back up himself. By the time the sun rose, and the position was finally secured, the official count of men Desmond Doss had personally lowered down that escarpment alone stood at 75, a number so difficult to believe that when his commanding officers first tried to verify it for his Medal of Honor recommendation, they deliberately lowered the figure they submitted, worried that 75 would sound too exaggerated to be credible, and settled on a more conservative number instead. Doss himself, in later years, said he genuinely wasn't certain of the total and thought it might have been closer to 50. Whatever the precise number, every account agrees on the basic fact: one unarmed medic, alone, under fire, on a ridge his own company had just retreated from, had saved dozens of men that night, who otherwise would have been left to die. Hacksaw Ridge was not the end of Desmond Doss's war, and it was not the last time his own life would nearly be the cost of someone else's survival. In the weeks of continued fighting on Okinawa that followed, Doss was himself severely wounded, hit by grenade fragments that tore into his legs during another engagement. Rather than calling for another medic to treat him and risk exposing someone else to the fire he was still under, Doss treated his own wounds as best he could and waited nearly 5 hours for stretcher bearers to reach him. While being carried out on that stretcher, the group came under renewed fire, and Doss, seeing another wounded man nearby who appeared more critically injured, rolled himself off the stretcher and directed the bearers to take the other soldier instead, choosing to wait longer for his own evacuation rather than take a spot he judged someone else needed more urgently. Shortly afterward, while crawling toward an aid station on his own, his arm was shattered by a Japanese sniper's bullet. With no one immediately available to splint it, Doss used the stock of a discarded rifle, an object he had refused to carry as a weapon for the entire war, and used it instead as a makeshift splint, binding his own shattered arm with a rifle butt and crawling nearly 300 yards to reach medical help under his own power. Desmond Doss survived Okinawa, though the wounds he carried out of that campaign, combined with a case of tuberculosis he contracted during his service, would affect his health for the rest of his life. On October 12, 1945, President Harry Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor at a ceremony at the White House, making Desmond Doss the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military decoration. His citation detailed the events atop Hacksaw Ridge in careful, formal military language, but the significance of the moment went far beyond the specific numbers in that citation. The army that had once tried to discharge him for refusing to carry a weapon was now holding him up as one of the most valorous soldiers of the entire war, proof that courage under fire had never actually required a rifle in the first place. The rest of Desmond Doss's life was shaped as much by the wounds he carried home as by the medal around his neck. The tuberculosis he'd contracted during his Pacific service cost him a lung and years of his health, and complications from his war injuries followed him for decades afterward. He lived modestly, largely out of the public eye, working small jobs and raising a family in rural Georgia, rarely seeking attention for what he'd done on that ridge in Okinawa. When people did ask him about it, he consistently deflected credit away from himself and back toward his faith, insisting that what happened atop Hacksaw Ridge wasn't a demonstration of his own extraordinary courage so much as a demonstration of what he believed God had asked of him and what he'd simply been trying to live up to since he was a boy, looking at a picture of Cain and Abel on his family's wall. Desmond Doss passed away on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, having outlived the war, the injuries, and the tuberculosis that so easily could have taken him decades earlier. He was buried with full military honors, remembered as the only conscientious objector of the Second World War to receive the Medal of Honor, and remembered by the men whose lives he'd personally saved on that escarpment as proof of something most of them had been slow to believe when they first met him in basic training, mocking a recruit who refused to touch a rifle. Here's what always stays with me about that night on Hacksaw Ridge. Every single other soldier on that plateau had a weapon in his hands, and every reasonable justification to retreat down that cliff face, along with the rest of the company, when the position became untenable. Desmond Doss had no weapon at all, and he climbed back up anyway, alone, into a fight that wasn't his to finish, because there were still men up there who needed him, and nobody else was in a position to reach them. He did it not once, but 75 times over, by some accounts lowering man after man down that rock face on a rope, praying for the strength to save just one more before turning around and going back for the next. He never fired a shot in the entire war, not one, and he still walked away from it as one of the most decorated combat soldiers of his entire division. That's not a contradiction. That's the whole point of who Desmond Doss was. Courage was never about the weapon in his hands. It was about what he was willing to walk back into, alone, unarmed, for men who had already been left for dead by everyone else.